Have you ever thought about ending your life? Or have you thought about being taken from it, perhaps being hit by a bus, falling asleep one night and never waking up, drifting off somehow? If that's the case for you, then I hope you'll continue watching this, and I hope the ideas that I'll discuss here can be of some value to you. Personally, I found these ideas to be both life-changing and quite literally life-saving for myself and for clients that I've worked with over the years. Now, let me start by saying that the notion of suicidality is quite anxiety-provoking for a lot of people. This is, I recognize, a delicate subject. It's a matter of life and death. And so, what I hope to do is tread lightly. And I trust that neither you nor I will lose our heads as we go about exploring this dark territory. Turns out that the therapeutic system of therapist and client kind of falls apart when the system is flooded with anxiety. So please, let's not trip as we go through this. Now, I approach this from the perspective of depth psychology, largely informed myself by the work of James Hillman, who describes psychopathology as this combination of these words, psyche, pathos, and logos. He takes the word back to its Grecian roots, and we see that psychopathology, what we so often in the modern world consider as crazy stuff, psychopathology, the word itself, can actually be interpreted as meaning something like the speech of the suffering soul, or perhaps something like the meaning of the soul's suffering. That changes things, doesn't it? If we explore the way that we look at the word itself, if we get a sense of the history of the word, doesn't this change perhaps how we relate to the phenomena themselves? Perhaps so. We might then wonder what, in the case of suicidal ideation, is the suffering soul attempting to say? What's the meaning of the soul's suffering? In what way is psyche suffering? And yet attempting to communicate something to us through these symptoms, through these thoughts about ending our lives. Now, one of the things Hillman describes in this book, I can't recommend it enough. It's a tough one, but worthwhile revisioning psychology. Hillman describes that one of the pitfalls of the way that we so often approach psychological phenomena is through the lens of literalism, and we lose the metaphor itself here. So we see things in this fixed perspective. We're unable to see through the things to what they represent, to the psychological backdrop of the things themselves. Now, what do these words even mean? What am I getting at here? In the case of suicidal ideation, for example, what we might consider is that this is not necessarily the end of a life. That would be the literal or the literalization of suicidality, is ending a life. Rather, we could look at this as a call for the end of a way of living. We could see through these thoughts about suicide to what they are calling for, which is the end of a way of living. And tragically, our culture has this soul sickness, this tendency to literalize phenomena. And so, unfortunately, quite often when people encounter these thoughts of suicidality without any real psychological literacy, they take them literally and they fail to see through them to the metaphorical backdrop. I can remember in my most recent bout of suicidal ideation, I locked up my firearm and I gave one of each of the keys to each of my best friends. And I remember saying to them, I need you to hold on to this because I'm afraid I'm going to take this literally. Oof. Even in saying that now, I notice this upwelling of emotion. was afraid. I was afraid that I was going to take this literally. I'd been giving quite a lot of thought to ending my life. I'd been exploring how it might go. I'd been putting together a plan. So I said to each of them, I'm afraid I'm going to take this literally. So I gave each of them key. And then I'm left with this really difficult challenge of taking up the metaphorical call, this suffering soul's speech. I actually was then in a situation where I was forced to listen to it and to act in accordance with it. And oof, that meant making some very difficult choices about the kind of life that I was living. And as painful as it was to make those choices, it kept me going. So in that moment, when I decided to take up the suicidal ideation from the metaphorical perspective or a depth psychological perspective rather than from a literal lens, I do believe that was life-saving for me in that moment. And if I could take this a bit further, situations with various clients over the years, they've revealed that there actually is something vital in the experience of suicidal ideation sometimes. There is something of profound psychological value if we can again tread lightly and explore these phenomena from the metaphorical standpoint. And I recall a conversation with a client who was describing this imagery of slitting the wrist. And as we were exploring this imagery and what they made of the imagery, why, of all the ways to end one's life, why slitting a wrist? What is it about that that had such an appeal? We began to explore. And this client described that something in the image, there was a desire to get closer to the lifeblood, to the pulsing stuff of the heart. And we were both a little stunned by that. It became clear that in this client's experience of suicidal ideation, in the imagery that presented to them in the midst of this, there actually was something vital. There was a desire to get closer to the stuff of the heart. So we can begin to take up this question metaphorically rather than, again, literally, the merely physical act of cutting, slitting, whatever the case is. And that was a significant realization for this person. It was significant for me to take that into consideration too. That even the image itself that presented to the person in this experience of suicidal ideation, the image itself called for something about the new way of living. It communicated something about the way in which the soul had been suffering. The image itself spoke something. It was calling this person toward their heart. Now, it did so in this gruesome way, this pathological way, whatever words, adjectives we want to affix to this thing. But let's not forget that the primary material, we might say, of psychic reality is image. Psyche communicates through image. Images govern our lives. They're what organize our behavior toward the fulfillment of that image. So it's worth some exploration as to the contents of the image. There can be something communicated there, as well as the context of the image. So in this client's case, we came to this conclusion together that there was something in them that wanted them to come closer to their heart, to get a more direct contact with the pulsing, feeling stuff of their lives. Now, all of that content is in the context of this clarion call for the end of a way of living, which again, people can easily literalize as the end of a life. How are we doing so far? I know that this can be Hmm, anxiety-provoking material. I'm a little on edge even as I talk through some of this because, oh God, it hits close to home. Hmm. But anyway, it feels good for me to talk about this with you, and hopefully it feels good for you to engage in these ideas too. And maybe there's a way where neither one of us in this kind of exchange were quite so alone with that experience. At least I have that hope for us. So, another thought we might take into consideration, another idea for us here. There's a question for you, for not you necessarily, but a question for the literal minded ego, which might think purely in terms of the physicality of this and the ending of life. We might ask that literal minded ego, to what does your life belong? And we could play with the words some. We could change this up and say, what does your life long to be? Now we can see in this that we start to personify your life. And in this act of personification, which Hillman again in Revisioning Psychology says is one of the main moves of an archetypal perspective, we personify these phenomena. To what does your life belong? What does your life long to be? You can see that this creates a little space in which you might begin to dialogue with your life rather than see this as some literal physical object that's yours for the taking to take your life. This could be, I don't know what, a way of relating to your life as it wishes to unfold. I think there is something there, something important in the longing to be. What does your life long to be? That has this quality of mourning to it, right? There's something of grief there too. This longing, it speaks toward a kind of absence that we mourn, the absence of something that we wish were present. Maybe it speaks to a kind of loss we're hoping to redeem for ourselves. I don't know. What occurs to me as I think out loud in this moment is that in this longing to be, there's some further vision that perhaps our lives have for us. And of course, in the experience of suicidality, it's like our vision for life is kind of collapsed. And so in that moment, maybe it is worth us considering if we take ourselves out of it for a moment, if we decenter ourselves, we then could consider what does life have in store for us if what we've wanted out of life has fallen apart. Hmm. Which reminds me, there was a section that I wanted to read to you that I think is of tremendous value in this conversation. Pull it up here. So this is from Psychoanalysis and Daseinsanalysis by the Daseinsanalyst Medard. He writes, how could anyone get better without the old neurotic world collapsing in the process? It is far too narrow and rigid to survive. And if this sort of destruction of the old neurotic prison is happening to you, is that really so dreadful? To be so filled with apprehension as you are, and to hear nothing but death and destruction on every hand, can only mean one is still imprisoned in the error of believing one's own neurotic, egocentric world to be the sole possibility of existence. And that when this shows signs of cracking, it means the crack of doom. He concludes, for the real essential being that is you, what is happening now is very far from being an end. It is merely a change taking place in its way of appearing. Oof, it gets me again as I read it here too. This is very far from an end. This is a change in a way of appearing. And there is something existential for us to consider amidst the experience of suicidal ideation. We are called by the suffering soul to another way of living. This is a call for the end of a way of living, to be sure. A life may well come to an end, but this is not your life. This is not you as a living subject. The suffering soul is calling for the end of a way of living. Oof, which means you have the very difficult task ahead of figuring out a new way of living. That is no small thing to figure out a way of being in the world that is perhaps very different from the way in which you were organizing your life. What this means, perhaps, is divesting your sense of security from the things on which your security seemed to depend, and reinvesting yourself in some different image for what your life longs to be. Now, having said all of that, boy, I know the question might be, well, the question in the back of my mind is like, yeah, but what do we do with these ideas? I wish I could tell you. I don't know that there's necessarily a program to implement out of something like this. Rather, you might see how you can sustain these ideas, how you can tend the coals of these things to keep the fire burning some. We're so quick to jump into the question of how. How do I do this? Why? What am I supposed to do? Give me an action plan. I don't know. There's an action plan for something so existential. I don't know that there's a series of steps to take to find a new way of living. But having said all of that, I do hope that these ideas can be of some value to you. I know for myself, they've been, as I mentioned before, both life-changing and quite literally life-saving, for which I'm very glad. I have a lot of appreciation for that. And I certainly hope that perhaps they can be of some good use in your life too. Could I end with a request, perhaps? So, out of all of what I've said, I imagine there are one or two things that stick with you. We might consider this the core idea, the difference that makes a difference, which is to say that out of all of this noise, there's some idea that's actually going to adjust the way that you organize yourself. It's going to change what you do and how you live your life from here on. So maybe you can give some thought to here again, what is the difference that makes a difference out of everything you've heard me say in this video? And perhaps you could share that in the comments down below. And we can begin to glean the wisdom of the group by seeing what different people take from something like this. That'll help both you consolidate what you've learned, and hopefully that will help this video be seen by more people who can make use of it. Because, boy, we have a problem with suicide in the modern world. And I wonder, given how much our existential landscape seems to be changing, given the realities of the meta crisis, so many different structures crumbling all at once, given the rapid changes in the technological landscape, what the doom on the horizon geopolitically as well, I suspect that we're going to see a tremendous increase in suicidality in the coming years, decades. And I certainly hope that we can take this as an existential call for a new way of living in the world, to bring to an end the way of living that has run its course, that has proven itself unsuccessful. I hope, pray that we find courage to take up a new way of living so we can approach our lives with a bit more sanity. Anyway, be well. I appreciate your attention, and I will look forward to speaking with you soon.